The next dichotomy, or the next situation that the president finds himself in when it comes to conflicting roles, would be the president's role as chief of state versus his role as chief executive. As we've talked about earlier in the semester, the United States uses a presidential system in which the chief of state and the chief executive are the same person. Whereas in a parliamentary system, the chief of state and chief executive are different people. In the United States, one person is expected to be both chief of state and the chief executive. And the chief of state, or head of state, as it says on the screen, is the person that conducts the activities of the United States government that generates respect or loyalty. Their official or ceremonial duties. For example, if there is an Olympic Games held in the United States, it is the head of state, the president, who goes and welcomes the rest of the world to the Olympics. If there is a holiday like Memorial Day or Veterans Day, where the country should be respecting the veterans in our country, it would be the head of state who would go to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier or to some place of respect and place the wreath. Another example of the duties of head of state: if the leader of another country visits the United States, the head of state is supposed to be there to greet him or her. The head of state would conduct, a meal or a dinner in their honor at the White House. That's the roles of head of state. Now, the chief executive in the United States is the same person, the president, but when the president is acting as chief executive, he's the person who's in charge of the day-to-day operations or administration of the government activities. So it's the president that's in charge of the bureaucracy. It's the president who's in charge of making sure that the money that Congress appropriates to the different government entities is being spent properly. It's the president who creates the cabinet. It's the president who is in charge of the military and all of those things. So here in the United States, the one person, the president, fills the role of head of state and chief executive. But in other countries, such as Great Britain, the head of state and chief executive are different people. Again, in Britain, they use a parliamentary system, and the prime minister is the chief executive. The prime minister is a member of the national legislature, the parliament, and he is picked from amongst the parliament to be the chief executive. He's in charge of the day-to-day operations of the government. The chief of state, or the head of state in Great Britain, is going to be either the king or queen, depending on who is sitting on the throne. Now, this may seem like a rather insignificant difference, but I want to explain to you a situation that happened several years ago in the United States. The United States was having some problems with the country of Iran, and President Bush went to the United Nations and called the president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, basically a two-bit dictator. Said that he was not the legitimate leader of the country of Iran. Now, President of Iran, Ahmadinejad, responded to what President Bush said by writing a letter to him explaining his position. Not a big deal. The president often has conflicts with other leaders. But what happened very shortly after President Bush called President Ahmadinejad a two-bit dictator, President Ahmadinejad was invited to speak at a university in New York City. When President Ahmadinejad came to the United States to speak at the university, he was being officially invited to the United States. And since he was officially invited to the United States, President Bush was obligated, based on the fact that he is the head of state of the United States, he was almost obligated to go greet this leader of Iran. Now, Bush was having a problem. If George Bush went and greeted Ahmadinejad and did the typical photo op, he would have looked weak to the American people. But if Bush does not go and greet Ahmadinejad, he makes himself and the Americans look arrogant to the rest of the world because international protocol says you greet them. Well, President Bush chose not to greet the president, Ahmadinejad. And what we expected was the American people stood up and applauded and said, good job holding your ground. But many countries around the world looked at the United States as arrogant Americans. They don't recognize the legitimate leaders of other countries. So that puts the president in a very strange position. Now, in England, there wouldn't be a problem. And in countries that use the parliamentary system, it wouldn't be a problem because most chief executives around the world can simply send the Queen or send the other person who's the official representative or head of state of the government, as these pictures show here. Queen Elizabeth is the English head of state, and here's a picture of her and her husband greeting the President of the United States. But you also have the Prime Minister, who's the chief executive of England, and he's greeting the President of the United States. If this was a situation where the Prime Minister had just said something derogatory about the President of the United States, the Prime Minister could just simply choose to send the Queen, and there would be very little said in the international community because you're still fulfilling international protocol by sending your head of state. This puts the President in a very awkward situation. We purposely made the President both the head of state and the chief executive. And the final thing I want you to realize about the President is that the President has two constituencies, and this is very difficult for the President. Remember, constituencies are, the people that a person works for or represents. The President is the only person elected to represent the whole country. So when the President makes decisions, we would hope that he's making the decisions that would be best for his country. But we also have to realize that the President is the most powerful person in his political party. So the President wants to do what's best for the country, but he also wants to do what's going to benefit his party so that the next president can be from his party. Sometimes the President has that conflict, and it's because the President is the leader of both his party and the leader of the country. And we would hope, and I would probably agree, that most of the time the President is going to do what's best for the country because his role as President, his constitutional role as President, says you got to look out what's best for the country. But if the President truly believes that the best thing for the country is to have a Democrat as a president or a Republican as a president, then he may do what appears to be detrimental to the country in the short term, especially if you're from the other party, but what's best for his party in the long run so the next president will be of his party. This conflict that the President has between being the leader of the country and the leader of his party is many times very obvious during the first term of a president, whereas it becomes less of a conflict during his second term. Because very obviously, when the President is serving his first term, he would like to get his party's nomination for a second term. So the President is much more obligated to doing what his party asks him to do during his first term. But once he gets the nomination and is elected a second time, the President tends to have more freedom because even though they want the next president to be from their party, they do have some personal freedom because they can't get nominated again. And very few presidents ever go on to try and do anything politically as far as getting elected after their term in office is over. And a perfect example, again, is with President George Bush. George Bush was the governor of Texas before he became president of the United States. And as governor of Texas, he felt very strongly about wanting to help with the immigration problem. As governor of Texas, George Bush was very open to providing services and trying to find a way to keep the illegal immigrants in Texas involved. He even supported providing a way for illegal immigrants to gain citizenship. When he became president, he still wanted to do that. But that whole idea of giving illegal immigrants a path to citizenship without having to leave the country is very much opposed by most Republicans. So when Bush started to run for office the first time for president, he said, hey, I got this great idea about immigration policy. And the Republicans say, no, you can't do that because it's not our position. So for his first term in office, he didn't address the issue. It was still a personal issue for him that he felt he wanted to address, but he didn't do it during his first term in office. But as soon as he got elected to a second term, he personally started to push the issue of immigration reform, and he actually teamed up with the Democrats and tried to get an immigration bill passed through the Democratic Congress, which would allow illegal immigrants in the United States to become citizens without ever having to leave. It was very much opposed to by his Republican colleagues, but he chose to do it during his second term in office because he personally felt it would be best for the country. The president often has this conflict between his role as the leader of the country and his role as leader of his party. The president has many of these conflicts. Very rarely is the president making a decision that doesn't have one of these conflicts involved in it. Most members of Congress, all they're worried about is their district. When they make a decision, all they're worried about is their district. And as long as they keep their district happy, you never hear about it. But if you're the President of the United States, your district is the whole country. And when you make a decision, you're always going to make a large part of the country unhappy. You call those the dichotomies of the presidency. This next video, we're going to take a specific look at what the Constitution said about what the authorities of the president would be. And we're also going to take a look at what Congress and the other branches of government can do about the authorities that the Constitution gives to the president.